Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 2023 Rocky Mountains Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit, or CESU, online seminar series. My name is Lisa Gerloff, and I'm the Executive Coordinator for the Rocky Mountains CESU. If you're unfamiliar with CESUs, the CESU is a network of federal agencies, universities, and conservation organizations working together to provide for the research, technical assistance, and education needs of our federal resource partners. If you're curious to learn more, I will drop the web link in the chat box for you. This is our third year of offering these online seminars, and it's a fun way to showcase the talent and the work of our CESU partners. Our theme this year is understanding, documenting, and interpreting human history and cultural resources within our Western landscape. We kicked off the series on February 9th with University of Montana archaeology professor Doug McDonald. Doug gave an overview of his 17 years documenting cultural resources in Yellowstone National Park. A recording of his presentation is available on our seminar page, and again, I will drop that link into the chat box for you shortly. Briefly looking ahead to our April 5th and final seminar in this series for this year, Kat Blahaus will be joining us. Kat is a professor of architecture and historic preservation at the University of Colorado, Denver, and her presentation is titled Using Cultural Heritage to Educate the Next Generation, a Case Study Analysis. Kat has been working with a number of National Park Service units over the years through the CESU, helping them with their historic preservation needs. You can register for that presentation on our seminar page, and I'll also be sending an announcement out next week for that presentation as well. Today, I am thrilled to have Bob Reinhardt with us. Bob is an associate professor of history at Boise State University in Idaho. Bob also serves as Boise State's rep to our Rocky Mountain CESU Executive Committee. And over the years, I've gotten to know Bob over the phone and through the screen, and fingers crossed, we will actually get to meet in person in September for our annual meeting. Bob's public history project and the topic of today's presentation, the Atlas of Drowned Towns, is funded in part by CESU agreement with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm so happy to have Bob with us, and I am as excited as you to learn more about the history of inundated communities in the West. Bob will speak for about 40 minutes, and we will have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So I'm happy to turn it over to Bob.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thanks for putting this together. And I know I speak for many more than myself to say we're so glad that you're our main person working on the Rocky Mountain CESU. This project would not have got off the ground through this CESU agreement were it not for Lisa's help over the many years. So thank you, Lisa. And thanks to you folks for coming to this webinar. I appreciate you tuning in. And for being a part of this really great network of federal agencies and educational institutions. The CESU system is just such a fantastic way of connecting federal agencies, faculty, and students together around important work. And I'm honored to be a part of it, and I'm honored to be able to share some of the work that I'm doing under the auspices of the CESU. So what you have on your screens right now is a video that I took of American Falls on the Snake River a couple of Novembers ago. There you can see some of the foundations of the old town of American Falls. And I'll be bouncing around the West today in my conversation. Although the CESU agreement that I have focuses on the Willamette Valley, I'm very interested more broadly in this topic of places that were moved or destroyed to make way for large river development projects. So the first set of images that I'll show you after this video is from a place called Detroit, Oregon. And Detroit's about 48 miles up the North Santiam River, which itself feeds into the Willamette River, which then feeds into the Columbia River near Portland on its way to the Pacific Ocean. Detroit is near the confluence of the North Santiam River and the Breitenbush River in the homelands of the Santiam bands of the Kalapuya and Molalla peoples, in a place that is also very well known to the Warm Springs peoples. Now, most of the images that you see here, the places that you see here, are all underwater now. The Detroit that maybe some of you may be familiar with is a very different place from old Detroit. In 1952, about 45 families moved upriver and up in elevation to make way for the 3,500-acre reservoir for Detroit Dam, which is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers flood control and hydropower project that was completed in 1953. Here are a couple of photographs from Ben Maxwell, who was a photographer for the Statesman Journal newspaper in Salem. Now, I don't know how these photos make you feel, but they fill me with a sense of awe, of wonder, of curiosity. What was it like to live in these places? What was it like to have to leave Detroit? And not just there, but the dozens, actually hundreds of places that were moved or that disappeared to make way for river development projects. What was that like? And my talk today is a kind of biography of my interest in the topic, of the project that has grown out of that interest, and of where this project is headed, thanks to that CESU agreement that I have with the Army Corps of Engineers. But it's also a whole bunch of questions, because I'd love to get your help in exploring and answering and posing more questions about this really fascinating topic. Now, I should warn you all that this is very different than Doug's excellent talk last month about the fantastic work he's been doing in Yellowstone. I am in relatively early stages with this project, especially under the CESU agreement, which we got started back in October of this last year. Okay, a little bit of background on my interest in the topic of drowned towns. It started when I was a master's student many years ago at the University of Oregon, where I was studying U.S. Western history. And there I wrote my thesis on the communities of this place called the North Santiam Canyon, which follows the North Santiam River from the crest of the Cascade Mountains westward towards Salem, from Marion Forks down to Lyons and Mahama. And here's an image that I printed in the book that eventually came out of that master thesis. One of the communities in this canyon is called Detroit, which is known more recently because it tragically burned to the ground during those horrific wildfires in the summer of 2020. But again, that was New Detroit. The site of Old Detroit is at the bottom of Detroit Reservoir, and that's the reservoir created by Detroit Dam, the dam built by the Corps and completed in 1953. I found it to be a fascinating story, and not just from an academic or intellectual perspective. I actually married into Old Detroit in some ways through my wife's grandmother, who went to school in Old Detroit. Now, that interest that got started when I was a master's student continued with a paper that I wrote that compared it to a different community up in Washington that was not moved, but was in fact simply eliminated. I then took a slight detour writing my dissertation and my first book about the eradication of smallpox in the 1960s and 1970s, but I remained interested in and fascinated by the idea of drowned towns. And I was reminded of it every time I drove by Detroit, which was quite often. I got back to this topic of drowned towns in a meaningful way in 2017 when I took a position at Boise State, which allowed me to return to teaching and to researching and to exploring this topic. And I continue to be surprised by how little exploration has been done about these kinds of displaced communities. We know a lot about the dams, but we don't know so much about the communities that were displaced and destroyed by such dams. In the American West in the 20th century, we're pretty familiar as historians with the size and the scope of dam building, especially in the 1930s and 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s. Dozens upon dozens of large dams in the American West From Detroit, which I've already mentioned, these are all on your screen now, Army Corps of Engineer projects, McNary in 1954, Dworshak was one of the later projects in 1973, but of course, Bureau of Reclamation projects like Grand Coulee or Fort Peck on the Missouri, and also private and municipal dams like Brownlee, Oxbow, and Hells Canyon, which are the projects that make up the Hells Canyon complex for Idaho Power. Here you have a very crude Google My Map and a very incomplete Google My Map of some of the dams and some of the communities. And this is a work in progress. A lot of it is fed by user contributions, but it's just here I'm putting it out there as a kind of crude visual representation of just how many dams we're talking about and how many places we're talking about that were moved or disappeared. We're, as historians, quite familiar with the reasons and the justifications, as well as the effects and the impacts of this dam building boom. These dams were built for irrigation, for hydropower, for flood control, for navigation later on, plus recreation and pollution abatement. Many of these dams are so-called multi-purpose river development projects, which is the Army Corps of Engineers term of art for this. The broader idea, of course, was to sustain and further encourage the growth of urban populations with some benefits accruing to rural populations as well. And the effects and impacts were many of those kinds of benefits, including electricity at a very, very low rate, flood control, but also more broadly, these dams completely rearranged the landscapes that they were in. They turned rivers like the Columbia into a series of lakes, and they reconfigured in many ways American society, culture, and the economy. These are things that we as historians have talked a lot about when it comes to dam development in the American West. And there is some, but some relatively limited in terms of the extent of it, scholarship on displaced communities. I put up here 3 books in the top that I think are really fantastic. One is Katrine Barber's book on Celilo Falls, which is a really great example of a particularly strong area in scholarship, which is concerned with native displacement. And then Erica Busemek's book, which just came out this last year, called The Foundations of Glen Canyon Dam, Infrastructures of Dispossession on the Colorado Plateau, traces the history of this dispossession farther into the past than projects that focus on immediate dispossession. And then archaeologists like April Bysaw have been interested in this topic as well. Her work is about places in New York. And then perhaps some of you are familiar with some of the instances of drowned towns in pop culture. Ivan Doig's book, Bucking the Sun, focused on Fort Peck Dam. The Coen brothers' film, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, is about some unspecified river development project in the American South with a reference to the TVA. And then here's a screenshot that I took a while ago from Atlas Obscura, which at that time had 5 items that were tagged as drowned towns. I think there's now like 7 or 8. So there's some popular interest in this as well, and some popular explorations of this, but there are a lot of questions that have been unasked and unexplored, I think. And some of those are, and I'll just take us back to this screenshot here. Some of those are quantifiable basic stuff about these dams and communities displaced, like how many places are we talking about? So when April was writing her book about communities displaced in New York, she contacted me and she said, my publisher wants to know how many places were moved. How many are there? And I was like, well, hundreds is probably a good place to start, but that's kind of one of the things I want to do with this project is figure out how many, which of these dams required community displacement? Where were they exactly? How many people were displaced? How were they compensated, if at all? Where did they go? I mean, these are some relatively basic questions that we don't know. We know a little bit about some specific cases, but not certainly at any comprehensive level. There are also deeper questions, frankly, that I'm much more interested in. What were the characteristics, the demographic, the socioeconomic, the ethnic, so on, of these communities? What made these places expendable from the perspective of dam builders and supporters? How did these displaced communities respond to their removal? With enthusiasm, with acquiescence, with resistance? Why did they respond in those ways? Ultimately, I guess the big question that continues to push me, haunt me, was what was the experience of living in and having to leave these places? And so that's how we get started with the project of the Atlas of Drowned Towns as both a project and as a process. Here's a screenshot of another crude website. And the basic idea here, the working vision statement, the Atlas of Drowned Towns, is an effort to recover and interpret the histories of places lost to river development projects, which is to say large dams. And this project got a kickstart 3 or 4 years ago with grants from the Red Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, and also from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And these grants allowed me to do a few things. First, start gathering information and compiling that information about which dams and projects, where those towns were, with a focus on the Snake River is where the work started. And then started imagining what that might look like to pull all that information together and what it should try to do. And I met with other historians, social scientists, humanities scholars, digital engineers, basically just a whole bunch of other nerds to talk about what to do about drowned towns. But also, and perhaps in some ways more importantly, I think, meeting with local historical societies, local historians, tribal historians, and other community members to critique and expand and contract on some of these ideas that were coming out of those meetings with other historians through a series of community workshops that I did along the Snake River. These conversations were so informative and enlightening and inspiring, really. And they generated ideas and questions and helped to get things going in terms of dreaming out what this could look like, particularly in terms of some basic principles. And so with these folks, we sort of came to this list of values for the project, if you want to call it. It should be collaborative. It needs to be working with local historical societies, tribal governments, federal agencies, and so on. It should be focused on communities. It should emphasize the perspectives and experiences of displaced peoples and their descendants. It should be comparative. This is one of the things that I think needs some development in the scholarship. But we need to provide ways to compare, contrast, and learn from the diverse processes and experiences of displacement. It should be comprehensive in the sense that it's not just looking at towns. Drowned towns has a nice ring to it. I'm going to trademark it at some point. But, I'm not just looking at unincorporated villages or incorporated towns, but also tribal homelands, isolated farms, ranches, and villages. It should be coherent. It needs to provide a platform by which to navigate between all of these different places. And it needs to be connected to the many other scholars and people that are working on histories of displacement, because it's not just me. And that's one of the things that's a part of this project from the beginning, is thinking about how to build something that other people that are interested in this topic can engage with. All this is great, right? But how to do that? I mean, and that's a big question, how? And I mean that in two ways. First of all, this is huge. Although I have started with the American West, and even more specifically, when I got started, it was with the Snake River initially. This is not a story that is unique to the American West or to the United States. You all know that there are very big dams that have caused a lot of displacement in other parts of the world. The Three Gorges Dam in China, for instance, displaced about 1.5 million people. I cannot become the expert on all of that. And I also don't want to build something that doesn't incorporate that and open doors for that other work to become part of it. So how do we make something where, it's going to be, it'll be the infrastructure whereby other people that are interested in studying this topic can do it, and how to find the time and the resources to do that, and how to manage all of that data and information. What kind of database and front end and research and quality control and other process, what has to be built to make this work? And this is where the CESU comes in. Through a series of happy coincidences, I began conversations with the natural resource manager, archaeologists, historians, public affairs officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Willamette Valley Project Office. Detroit is one of 13 dams in the Corps' Willamette Valley Project, the WVP. And it turns out that these folks had already been digitizing some of their files, towns, structures, roads, bridges, images, engineered drawings, survey maps. They had all this data that they were collecting and processing, all this historical information that they were collecting and processing, so that they could ideally, they were thinking, how can this help us improve management of the system? How can this help us better understand the places that we're working? How can this help us better with public outreach? But they weren't quite sure how to make sense of it all, how to do that. In other words, this was the perfect situation for a CESU agreement. And so now we've got the screenshot with the Corps logo and the RMCESU logo. This is a perfect situation of a CESU agreement working. It's a federal agency with the need and resources. And it's me with experience, maybe some expertise, but certainly enthusiasm enough to say yes to this huge project. It took the better part of a year to figure out the kinks of this, and then I applied, and in the end we came up with a 5-year agreement, which I'll put up here. I know this is a lot of text, and I'm sorry about that, but it gives you some sense of what we're headed after here, with a mission to create community-centric research processes and tools for doing research on heritage resources in these places in the Willamette Valley Project. By developing community engagement processes, models, methodologies, and tools, And what's going to come out of this? Well, comprehensive community outreach events, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and some reports about that. And then also a digital platform based in a pretty rich database to distribute and collect this heritage information, with the objectives or the outcomes of having a clearer and more precise understanding of the communities affected by the WVP that can inform system management and operations, and have more systematic and comprehensive community outreach and engagement processes and systems. So all that's a lot of text. And then the other thing that's not on here, but is always so important to CESU and agreements, and which is such a great thing about the program, is student training. For graduate students, we have a master's program in history. Undergraduate students, getting these students into the archives, out in the field, into these communities, as well as classroom work that we're doing with this. Okay, so through all of that, what might this thing look like? I'm going to walk you through a non-functional mock-up of the second version 2.0 of the Atlas of Drowned Towns. We're a few months into the project. We've hired a local software developer, and we're going back and forth on the design of it. But here's sort of a preview of some ideas that I came up with a graphic designer. So you've got a map of the West here, sort of looking at a region, and a time slider at the bottom, where if you move that slider backward and forward, the number of dams, where the symbols representing dams and communities would pop forward or pull back depending on time. And then some drawers basically on either side. On the left, you can kind of see what zoom level you're in. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. You can choose from different kinds of interpretive stories provided by students involved in the project. On the right, maybe there'll be a slider that provides some quantitative information that changes over time. Everything from how many people were displaced to what was the population distribution between rural and urban places. These are helped, the idea here is that these might help provide some the basis for interpreting these processes of displacement and the effects on them. So this would be at sort of the region level. And then let's say you wanted to click on one of those stories, then one of the interpretive stories would pop up that a student will have written about, in this case, for instance, the dam building boom of the 50s and 60s. But then let's say you hover over the Willamette Valley Project and you click on that, and then you zoom into the Willamette River Basin, and here you start getting other kinds of data. Some of the quantitative information on the right changes a little bit, but you also start to get options over on the left to put further layers. So for instance, let's say you clicked on historic maps, and then you might have a transparency layer showing you historic maps of this place that changes depending on how you move the slider. Or maybe you could have symbols pop up that demonstrate where there were public hearings about these dams. So you're at the basin level now, and now you move down to the project by which we mean the dam. And in this case, we're talking about Detroit Dam. Here, again, stories and layers that you can choose on the left, quantitative information on the right, but perhaps we'll also have ways of representing with symbols things like in-migration and out-migration, or the amount of money flowing in or out of these kinds of places. So this is actually one of the trickier parts of the platform that I'm working on with a software developer now. And then let's say you click on Old Detroit. Now you're moving into the place level, the community level. And here you've triggered the aerial view, which is overlaid on the base map, an aerial map from 1949 that is showing the town of Old Detroit. And you can see on the right there are different kinds of quantitative information, a lot of it being pulled from census records to give you some sense of this community, but also icons on the front where you could click on one of those camera icons, and it would show you pictures from that location, or maybe a binocular that would show you a bird's eye view of this spot. And then finally, and perhaps most ambitiously in terms of where this might hit a street view, which in this case, those icons there, let's say you click on the speaker, then you get an oral history from that guy who's holding up that post there, or you click on that journal and you see, or that book, and you get that person's journal. And perhaps at some point, I would love for this to become basically a virtual reality experience of being able to walk through these towns at particular moments in time. Like here, you've got highlighted during the dam construction period. This is a picture from 1950, or a postcard, I should say. Okay, so again, non-functional, but you get the idea about what this is going after, I hope. How is that going to happen? Well, you've got to get a lot of data, and you're going to get it a lot of different kinds of sources. So in the middle, in this diagram here, you've got a tentative version of all the different kinds of data that would be useful in helping to identify and make sense of these places, everything from obviously photographs to 3D scans of existing artifacts, on through quantitative information that could be pulled from sources like the National Inventory of Dams, but also census records. All that eventually gets pumped through an analysis process into the front end, but on that front end is also a user contribution portal represented over there on the right, by which people could send in, as they have done. I've had more than 70 people after a recent talk I gave email me saying, "Matt, do you know about this place?" to contribute their own information, in addition to me, that is under that researcher box in the top left, students, collaborators like the Corps of Engineers, other contributors digging through all of these archives and research resources and then pumping it into the database. One of the ways that we're going to get information into this system, and one of the ways we're fulfilling the objectives of the CESU arrangement, is you'll notice over on the left, and maybe it's like the 7th bullet point down, this community collection events. We're calling them history jamborees. And maybe some of you are familiar with History Harvest, which is a program that University of Nebraska started a while ago. The basic idea of these history jamborees is to bring people together to talk about the history of an inundated place, to share their memories and their photographs and other artifacts about that topic, and to discuss and to learn about that event within the context of other such events of community displacement. It's going to be a 2-day event. I think it's going to be, our first one will be in Detroit this October, 21st and 22nd. Still trying to get the venue worked out, but we'll have presentations, we'll have oral history interview stations, we'll have scanners to scan documents, we'll have a 3D scanner to scan artifacts, we'll have workshops on how people can do their own oral history interviews and make plans for preserving their family heirlooms that they'd like to donate later on to museums. So through these history jamboree events, these are community outreach and engagement events that are meant to both provide information and material and stories that will be a part of the Atlas of Drowned Towns, but really to connect with communities about this topic, which is one of the things that the Army Corps of Engineers wants to do. Okay, so through those kinds of efforts, through the kind of research that I've described here, through the kinds of research materials that can be used to make sense of these places, to learn about these places, which I have here, everything from the agency itself down to proactive collection events like history jamborees and county assessors' offices and the census and so on and so forth. What will we learn? Well, I'm not sure what we're going to learn, but I can tell you some of the material we're digging into and some of the interesting insights and people that are uncovered through that research, and some answers to some of those bigger questions, especially in terms of how people responded to displacement. So I mentioned already that the Corps of Engineers in the Willamette Valley has already started digitizing an incredibly rich set of sources, from real estate acquisition documents, so on, that you see here. Let me just show you some of those. So here is a tract map from the real estate division from Old Detroit, particular segments F and G. And just to give you some orientation here, you can see the blocks in the middle are real estate property. You've got symbols representing where the Southern Pacific Railroad Company had its line, which was eventually moved. And then you also have boxes or tables that provide information about who owned that piece of property when the Corps bought it out. And then what we're doing is we're taking that information to the county clerk's office to get the real estate transaction records, where we can start to trace back the ownership of that property back to when the land was taken from Native peoples. You also, from the Corps of Engineers, get correspondence. And here, I know you cannot make it out, but I just wanted you to get some sense of the handwriting of this guy named David Orr, who lived in Old Detroit in 1938. And this is a really, in many ways, heartbreaking letter that he sent to the Corps when he heard that the Corps was thinking about building a dam in Detroit. And he explained his home, and he talked about, if our flat, this is quoting from him, if our flat of several hundred acres are flooded, then lots of poor people who are building homes here will be without a place to go. He described his own place as being a large log house with a good well, 7 apple trees, and 2 large cherry trees, all of which are bearing. And unless you have a magic wand, you cannot produce them short of 15 years, really describing, trying to get a sense of his rootedness, literally, to this place. He then explained that he was 69 years old and deaf, who recently lost his wife. And he basically begged that the Corps change its plans and move the dam to someplace else. And the Corps responded with a 2-page letter, responded to Orr's 2-page letter with a half-page note that explained that, quote, this office has no authority to buy lands in the proposed reservoir at this time. It was too early at that time. And neither has this office, they continued, any means of aiding you in making a trade or sale of your place, much as it would like to be of assistance to you. So here we're starting to get at some of this experience of displacement through correspondence. Also, internal reports and documents. Here I'm going to actually move you out of Detroit up onto the North Clearwater River in northern Idaho and Dworshak Dam, which was completed in 1973. Among the materials that are really valuable for this project are some of the project reports and design memoranda.
Sorry, folks, we don't know what happened there, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming back
on.
Well, you know, we'll have a recording of it. Maybe we could make that available to the people that did come earlier. I didn't take attendance, but anyway, it's
I will
good
do
to,
that automatically. So
awesome,
yeah.
Cool, great. Well, you know, let's see, given time and the fact that I do want to get some questions from people, I might skip a couple of my slides. Where I was just talking about how these real estate and other kinds of reports from the Corps really have some valuable information, everything from sort of quantifying how many people were displaced. In this case, over on Dworshak Dam, they counted 30 families, 11 farmsteads, 19 cabins and dwellings, 1 school, 4 camps, 2 airstrips. Also have photographs sometimes of these removed, or I should say not just removed, but often eliminated structures. And photographs are a real rich source of information too. Sometimes there'll be a gold mine. I showed you some photographs from the Statesman Journal. Here are some photographs from Robinette, which was a town on the Oregon-Idaho border, which was eliminated to make way for Brownlee Dam. And these photos were taken by a guy named Pete Bashy, who lived there from 1942 to 1957. They've got hundreds of these beautiful, amazing photographs available through the Baker County Library. Another set of resources comes from local archives. So I've got on the right here an oral history that was recorded in 1976 with a guy named Alfred Jenks, who was displaced because of Dworshak Dam. And the question he was asked was, did you like it when they built the dam? And he said, I hated it. It done away with my native homeland that I loved as much as anything I ever did love. I hated to leave it. Of course, I was always against any dam, really, because look at our fish runs has been destroyed and all of this stuff. So you've got these, this is a different way of having experienced displacement. The image on the left is a map of old Detroit, hand-drawn by a former resident of Detroit, Jim Stallman. He did this for the Corner Post Eatery, which sadly burned down in the wildfires of 2020. But here's another kind of really interesting artifact. Jim must have had that aerial shot to go off of when he did this, but this is a different kind of map of the place that's really interesting, I think, to contrast with the tract map from the real estate office of the Corps. And then another source of information is comments and feedback through the website. Here, I think we've got a couple of really interesting memories. One from somebody who talked to their grandfather about the flooding of the reservoir and thus the loss of Robinette. And he told me that it was an easy decision for folks back in that day. Because for one, they needed the work badly, and secondly, they needed good, reliable power, something they did not have at the time. And there are many of these other kinds of places, other people working on them. Genevieve Johansson is working on this history of a place called Sopris, Colorado. Anyway, lots of different material coming together and trying to make sense of it and to provide a platform for other places to become a part of this comparative experience. And it's a real honor to be a part of this, to help the Corps with community outreach and engagement, particularly as management of the system in the Willamette Valley will change because of EIS rulings and climate change. The Corps is going to have to continue to work with communities, and hopefully my project, both in its community engagement methods as well as some of what it might reveal about how the Corps interacted with communities in the past, can be useful for that. Hopefully it can help the Corps fulfill some of its Section 106 and Section 110 under the National Historic Preservation Act obligations. It has an obligation to preserve historic structures, to proactively seek out historic and cultural resources. And, bigger objective, recalculating our cost-benefit analysis so that experiences like David Orr and his displacement from Detroit somehow figure out a way into those nice and tidy tables about the costs and benefits of such displacement. So that is my presentation. I'm sorry that the internet didn't like it enough to keep it going for the whole time, but I do want to leave a little bit of time here in case anybody has any questions, which I'm happy to field. And I also encourage you to go to the website and send in your comments about Drowned Places or about the next version where the mock-up is up there on the website too. Thank you very much, folks.